March 17, 1945, 5:52 a.m., Iwo Jima. The rocket hit just below the firing port, and the world turned white. Not orange like napalm. Not red like tracers. Pure, blinding, screaming white. Hundreds of burning particles sprayed through the concrete slit like a horizontal meteor shower, each fragment trailing smoke thick enough to choke a man dead in 10 seconds. Inside that bunker, 3 Japanese machine gunners, who had killed 11 Marines in 2 days, began to burn alive. The phosphorus embedded in their skin, in their uniforms, in the wooden ammunition crates stacked against the wall. Water could not stop it. Dirt could not smother it. Nothing on earth could make it stop. 5 seconds after impact, the screaming started. 15 seconds after impact, the rear door of that bunker, a door so well camouflaged that American forces had not spotted it, in 3 days of observation, exploded open. 3 defenders stumbled into daylight, clawing at white flames, eating through their flesh. They made it 10 feet before Browning automatic rifle fire cut them down. The machine gun that had pinned an entire Marine company for 48 hours went silent forever. And the 19-year-old kid who pulled that trigger, a former grocery clerk from Illinois named James Morrison, stood there with smoke still curling from his bazooka tube hands, shaking, staring at what he had just unleashed. He had never fired one of these rounds before. He did not even know what was inside the warhead. All they told him was point shoot, and do not look directly at the impact. That single rocket, a 3.4-pound projectile, containing 1.3 pounds of white phosphorus, had just accomplished in 20 seconds what artillery bombardment, satchel charges, and flamethrower assaults had failed to achieve in 3 days. The weapon that did this had no official name the Marines recognized. The instruction sheet called it the M10WP round. The Japanese called it something else entirely. They called it White Death. And by the time the battle for Iwo Jima ended, this forgotten weapon would save hundreds of American lives, break the will of defenders who had sworn to die rather than retreat, and change the mathematics of Pacific warfare forever. But to understand why a chemistry experiment stuffed inside a bazooka rocket mattered more than 16-inch naval guns and 500-pound bombs, you need to understand the nightmare American forces walked into on February 19, 1945. And why by March of that year, the United States Marine Corps was running out of ways to keep its men alive. The problem started 8 months before the first Marine hit the beach. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kurabayashi, the Japanese commander assigned to defend Iwo Jima, was not a typical officer. He had traveled to the United States before the war. He had studied American industrial capacity, American determination, and American willingness to absorb casualties when victory seemed achievable. He understood something most Japanese commanders refused to accept. The banzai charge was suicide without purpose. The beach defense was a waste of men against naval gunfire superiority. Kurabayashi threw away the entire Japanese defensive playbook and wrote his own. He ordered his 21,000 defenders underground. His engineers carved 11 miles of tunnels through volcanic rock connecting 1,500 rooms, fighting positions, hospitals, and ammunition depots into a single organism of war. They built pillboxes with concrete walls 5 feet thick, reinforced with steel rails stripped from the island's manganese mines. They positioned machine guns in caves with multiple firing ports, so defenders could shoot retreat through tunnels and emerge somewhere else entirely when Americans counterattacked. Every position had interlocking fields of fire. Every approach was a killing ground. Every bunker was designed not to protect the men inside, but to extract the maximum number of American dead before it fell. Kurabayashi told his officers the truth. They were not going to win. They were going to make the cost of victory so horrific that America would think twice before invading the home islands. Every dead Marine on Iwo Jima was an argument against invading Japan. American commanders thought they understood the challenge. The Navy delivered the most intense pre-invasion bombardment in Pacific War history, 22,000 rounds of naval gunfire. Battleship shells weighing over a ton each hammered the island for 3 days. Spotters reported direct hits on bunker after bunker. Reconnaissance photos showed concrete structures, shattered defensive positions, obliterated gun emplacements, destroyed. The report said the island was softened. The reports were wrong. Kuribayashi had built decoy structures on the surface, false bunkers designed to absorb exactly this kind of bombardment, while the real fortifications waited underground, invisible, untouched, loaded with ammunition and manned by soldiers who had written their death poems and mailed their final letters home. On February 19, 1945, the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions hit the beach and walked straight into the trap. The first wave made it 200 yards inland before the island came alive. Machine guns opened from positions the Navy swore had been destroyed. Mortars fell with precision. That meant pre-registered firing coordinates on every square yard of open ground. Marines dove into the black volcanic ash and discovered it was too loose to dig foxholes. Men clawed at the ground, and the ground swallowed their efforts, while bullets tore the air above them. The weapons that were supposed to solve this problem failed one by one. The M1A1 bazooka, the standard American anti-fortification weapon, could penetrate 4 inches of armor plate at 300 yards. Against Kuribayashi's 5-foot-thick reinforced concrete walls, that penetration meant absolutely nothing. A shaped charge would punch through the outer layer, detonate inside the wall itself, and accomplish nothing except telling the defenders exactly where the attack was coming from. Artillery could not hit individual bunkers with enough precision to matter. Bombs cratered the surface, but left the tunnel network intact. That left flamethrowers. The M2 flamethrower worked. Jellied gasoline poured into a firing port would kill everyone inside a bunker within seconds. The problem was getting close enough to use it. The M2's effective range was 30 yards. 30 yards of open ground under direct machine gun fire, carrying 70 pounds of fuel on your back, knowing that one tracer round hitting your tanks would turn you into a fireball visible from the beach. On the first day alone, the 5th Marine Division lost 8 flamethrower operators in the first hour. Each one represented months of specialized training that could not be replaced. Each one died trying to cross a killing ground that the Japanese had spent 8 months perfecting. By March 17th, 26 days into the battle, American casualties had reached 19,217. 4,089 Marines were dead. The projection before the invasion had been 15,000 total casualties, a number already considered catastrophic. Reality had blown past that estimate and kept climbing. Company commanders were sending requests up the chain that all said the same thing. We cannot keep assaulting these positions with current weapons. We are losing men faster than we can replace them. We need something that reaches bunkers from cover. Something that does not require a Marine to stand in the open for 30 seconds. Something that kills defenders inside positions our explosives cannot collapse. What they did not know was that the Chemical Warfare Service had been building exactly that weapon since 1943. And the answer was already on the island, packed in sealed canisters, with yellow and white hazard markings, sitting in an ammunition dump 300 yards behind the front line, waiting for someone to figure out what it could do. The M10 white phosphorus rocket was not born from genius. It was born from desperation and chemistry. The concept was brutally simple. Take the bazooka platform that every Marine already knew how to operate. Remove the shaped charge warhead designed to kill tanks. Replace it with a thin metal casing packed with 3 pounds of white phosphorus and a small bursting charge engineered to scatter burning particles across the widest possible area. White phosphorus ignites spontaneously when exposed to oxygen. It burns at temperatures exceeding 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It cannot be extinguished with water. Submerge a burning particle and the reaction pauses. Pull it back into air, and it reignites instantly. The particles embed themselves in whatever they touch and keep burning until the phosphorus is completely consumed or the oxygen runs out. The M10's bursting charge was calibrated to fragment the warhead casing into approximately 400 pieces, while dispersing phosphorus particles ranging from dust-sized specks to fragments the size of a dime across a 40-foot radius. Inside an enclosed bunker, those particles consumed available oxygen while generating dense white smoke that reduced visibility to zero within 20 seconds. Defenders faced an impossible choice: stay inside and suffocate, run outside and face American rifles. The development had not been easy. White phosphorus reacts violently with moisture, and the Pacific theater was a humidity nightmare. Engineers solved this by hermetically sealing the phosphorus inside waterproof containers within the warhead, surrounded by buffer layers that prevented premature ignition from the rocket motor's heat. Every round required sealed storage with desiccant packets. Every round carried warnings that damaged or corroded seals meant the ammunition was too dangerous to fire. The Chemical Warfare Service facility at Pine Bluff Arsenal in Arkansas could produce approximately 15,000 rounds per month. The first production M10 rounds reached the Pacific in January 1945 and were distributed to select Marine units with almost no explanation. The rockets arrived in special canisters with prominent hazard markings following chemical warfare protocols rather than standard ordnance conventions. Armorers who had loaded bazookas for years handled the M10 with unusual caution. The yellow and white markings told them this was something different. Rumors spread through the ranks faster than official briefings. Something new. Something the brass thought might change everything. Nobody understood what white flame meant until they saw Staff Sergeant Robert Henderson's assault on that bunker complex on the morning of March 17th. Henderson was 23 years old, a machinist's son from Oregon, who had enlisted in 1942 and survived every major engagement the 5th Marine Division had fought across the Pacific. He was not a scientist. He was not an inventor. He was a staff sergeant who had watched too many Marines die trying to crack open bunkers with weapons that were not built for the job. When PFC Morrison showed up that morning, carrying an M10 round he had received from a weapons sergeant, with instructions that made no sense, Henderson did not ask questions. He did not request authorization. He looked at the bunker that had killed 4 Marines yesterday, looked at the strange rocket with its yellow and white markings, and made a decision. Martinez opened fire with his bar to suppress the bunker's firing port. Morrison rose to one knee, aimed, and squeezed the trigger. The rocket crossed 70 yards in less than a second. What happened next changed the tactical equation of the entire battle. Within 20 seconds, a position that had resisted 3 days of conventional assault was abandoned. Within 2 minutes, white smoke poured from every opening in the concrete structure. Within 8 minutes, Henderson's team had cleared the bunker and was scanning for the next target. Morrison had 5 more M10 rounds in his ammunition bag. By March 19th, every bazooka team on Iwo Jima had received white phosphorus rockets. 2,400 rounds distributed in 48 hours. Marine divisions reported 34% fewer casualties during bunker assault operations in the first week of widespread M10 employment. The weapon that nobody had heard of 48 hours earlier was suddenly the most requested ammunition on the island. But the initial success on Iwo Jima was only the beginning. The real test was coming. Okinawa. 82 days of the bloodiest fighting in the Pacific War. Cave complexes that made Iwo Jima's tunnels look like practice runs. And a Japanese garrison that had already heard the rumors about the American weapon that burned through stone and could not be stopped. The question was whether 1.3 pounds of white phosphorus packed inside a bazooka rocket could break an army that had been ordered to fight to the last man. In Part 2, we will find out. In Part 1, a 19-year-old grocery clerk from Illinois fired a rocket he had never seen before into a Japanese bunker on Iwo Jima. 20 seconds later, defenders who had sworn to die rather than retreat came running out burning alive, screaming for air. The M10 white phosphorus round had done in 20 seconds what 3 days of conventional assault could not. Marine casualties dropped 34% in the first week. The weapon worked. But working on a single island and winning approval for mass production across the entire Pacific theater were 2 completely different wars. Because in April 1945, even as Marines were dying on Okinawa at a rate of 300 per day, a group of officers in Pearl Harbor were about to bury the M10 program under a mountain of bureaucracy protocol and institutional pride. And the man standing between those officers and thousands of Marine lives was a Chemical Warfare Service major named Arthur Caldwell, who had never fired a weapon in combat in his entire career. Major Arthur Caldwell was 41 years old, a chemical engineer from the University of Michigan, who had spent 14 years working for DuPont before the war pulled him into uniform. He was not a warrior. He was not a leader of men in battle. He was a man who understood molecules the way infantrymen understood terrain. And he had spent 2 years designing, testing, and refining the M10 white phosphorus warhead at Pine Bluff Arsenal in Arkansas. He had calculated the optimal particle dispersion. He had solved the humidity problem that caused premature ignition. He had personally supervised the production of the first 15,000 rounds shipped to the Pacific in January 1945. When the after-action reports from Iwo Jima arrived at Chemical Warfare Service headquarters in late March, Caldwell saw exactly what he had predicted. The M10 was working. The 34% casualty reduction was real. Marine commanders on the ground were requesting 10 times the available supply. The logical next step was obvious. Scale production from 15,000 rounds per month to 75,000. Equip every bazooka team in the Pacific with white phosphorus capability. Get the weapon to Okinawa before more Marines died assaulting positions that the M10 could crack open in seconds. Caldwell drafted a formal production expansion request on April 3, 1945, and submitted it through channels to Pacific Fleet Command at Pearl Harbor. He expected approval within a week. What he got instead was a summons to appear before the Joint Ordnance Review Board on April 14th. The board was chaired by Rear Admiral Thomas Whitfield, a career naval officer who had commanded shore bombardment operations at Tarawa Saipan and Iwo Jima. Whitfield had spent 3 years building the doctrine that naval gunfire could neutralize Japanese fortifications before Marines ever hit the beach. The M10's success was, in Whitfield's view, an implicit accusation. If a $3 bazooka rocket could accomplish what 16-inch naval shells could not, then the entire pre-invasion bombardment doctrine was flawed. And if the doctrine was flawed, then the thousands of Marines who died on beaches that were supposed to be safe had died because of decisions Whitfield had endorsed. The meeting on April 14th lasted 2 hours. Caldwell presented his data. 2,400 M10 rounds expended on Iwo Jima, 112 fortified positions neutralized, 34% reduction in assault casualties. Average engagement time reduced from 45 minutes per bunker with conventional methods to 8 minutes with white phosphorus. The numbers were overwhelming. Whitfield was not impressed. "Major," the admiral said, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of a man who had 4 stars sewn on before Caldwell had finished his doctorate. "You are telling me that a chemical weapon fired from a tube that costs $11 is more effective against Japanese fortifications than sustained naval gunfire from a battleship. Is that your position?" Caldwell did not flinch. "Admiral, I am telling you that 1.3 pounds of white phosphorus delivered through a firing port accomplishes what 22,000 rounds of naval bombardment did not. The data supports this conclusion." The room went cold. 3 colonels on the review board shifted uncomfortably. A Navy captain pretended to study his notes. Whitfield's face hardened. "The Chemical Warfare Service has a history of overstating the effectiveness of its products, Major. Mustard gas was supposed to win the last war. It did not. I am not going to authorize diverting production resources based on one battle's anecdotal data. Request denied." Caldwell left that meeting with more than a denied request. He left with word spreading through Pearl Harbor that the Chemical Warfare Service was trying to undermine naval gunfire doctrine. Within 48 hours, his security clearance for accessing fleet bombardment effectiveness reports was revoked. His request to visit Marine units on Okinawa for field evaluation was blocked. A memorandum from Whitfield's office suggested that M10 stocks currently in theater be redesignated as smoke screening ammunition rather than anti-fortification ordnance, effectively stripping the weapon of its tactical classification. The M10 program was being buried alive. And on Okinawa, where the 1st, 6th, and 2nd Marine Divisions were grinding into the Shuri line against cave complexes that made Iwo Jima look simple, Marines were dying at a rate that would produce over 12,000 American casualties in April alone. But Caldwell found an ally in the last place anyone expected. Colonel Raymond Davis was not a chemist, not an engineer, not a bureaucrat. He was an infantry officer, commanding the 1st Battalion 7th Marines on Okinawa, and on April 20th, 1945, he was staring at a problem that was killing his men. A cave complex near the village of Kakazu had resisted 6 days of conventional assault. Demolition charges, napalm strikes, flamethrower attacks, direct artillery fire. Nothing worked. The caves were limestone honeycomb structures with dozens of interconnected chambers and exits that allowed defenders to vanish and reappear like ghosts. Davis had lost 19 men trying to crack Kakazu. He had exactly 37 M10 rounds that had been shipped to Okinawa as part of the original Iwo Jima allocation before Whitfield's review board shut down further distribution. 37 rounds. No authorization to request more. No official tactical doctrine for their employment. No guarantee they would even work against limestone caves instead of concrete bunkers. Davis did not care about authorization. He cared about the 19 dead Marines whose names he had memorized and the 100 more who would die if Kakazu held for another week. He contacted Caldwell directly through a back channel, a radio operator who had served at Pine Bluff before transferring to the Pacific. The message was brief. Need M10 technical guidance. Cave targets not concrete. Limestone composition. Can your rounds penetrate? Caldwell's response arrived within hours, hand-delivered by a Chemical Warfare Service liaison officer who had been quietly reassigned to Okinawa before Whitfield's travel ban took effect. The response included detailed firing angles for cave entrances, optimal detonation distances to maximize particle dispersion in irregular spaces, and one critical piece of information. Limestone Itati was porous. White phosphorus particles would embed deeper in limestone than concrete, creating sustained burning that could last up to 4 minutes instead of 90 seconds. Davis read the technical brief, looked at his 37 remaining M10 rounds, and made a decision that would either save his battalion or end his career. He was going to assault Kakazu with white phosphorus, without authorization, without official doctrine, without anyone's permission except his own. April 22, 1945, 0430 hours. The pre-dawn darkness over Kakazu was split by mortar illumination rounds, casting yellow shadows across the limestone ridgeline. Davis positioned 3 bazooka teams at distances ranging from 60 to 120 yards from the cave complex's primary entrances. Each team carried a mixed load: 2 M10 white phosphorus rounds and 4 standard high-explosive rounds. The plan was simple in concept and terrifying in execution. Simultaneous white phosphorus strikes on the 3 largest cave openings, followed by suppressive fire on every secondary exit the battalion had mapped over 6 days of observation. Davis had identified 11 exits. He assigned riflemen and BAR teams to cover each one. If the phosphorus drove defenders out, they would emerge into prepared killing zones. If the phosphorus failed, Davis would have wasted his last specialized ammunition and would be back to conventional assault by sunrise. 12 men from his company had volunteered to form the suppression teams. Every one of them had lost friends at Kakazu in the previous week. At 0447, Davis gave the signal. 3 bazooka operators fired simultaneously. The rockets crossed the open ground in less than 2 seconds. The first round struck the main cave entrance dead center. The second hit 3 feet to the right of a secondary opening close enough for particle scatter to reach the interior. The third round, fired by a corporal named Santiago, who had never handled M10 ammunition before, hit the limestone wall 2 feet above the third entrance. For one horrible second, Davis thought the third shot had missed entirely. Then the physics took over. The white phosphorus detonated against porous limestone exactly as Caldwell had predicted. Particles did not bounce off the rock surface the way they deflected from concrete. They embedded. They burrowed into the stone's natural pores and channels. They followed cracks and fissures deeper into the cave structure than any direct hit could have reached. The limestone itself became a delivery system, carrying burning phosphorus fragments into chambers that no weapon had ever reached. The effect was devastating. White smoke began pouring from the 3 targeted entrances within 10 seconds. Within 30 seconds, smoke was emerging from exits Davis had mapped on the far side of the ridge over 100 yards from the impact points. The cave complex's ventilation system, the same network of natural channels that had kept defenders supplied with breathable air during napalm attacks, was now pulling phosphorus smoke into every connected chamber. 40 seconds after impact, defenders began emerging. Not from the 3 targeted entrances, but from the secondary exits. 2 men from the first exit, 5 from the second, 3 from the third. They stumbled into the killing zones Davis had prepared, disoriented, choking some with phosphorus particles burning through their uniforms. The Marine suppression teams opened fire. Within 8 minutes, it was over. 42 Japanese defenders were killed or captured. 42 men driven from positions they had held for 6 days against everything the American military had thrown at them. Davis's casualties for the entire operation were 0. No Marines wounded. No Marines killed. 0 casualties against a position that had cost 19 lives using conventional methods. The battalion's after-action report, written by Davis himself and transmitted to division headquarters at 0600, contained one sentence that would change the trajectory of the M10 program. White phosphorus employment against limestone cave positions produced complete defensive collapse in under 10 minutes, with 0 friendly casualties compared to 6 days of conventional assault, resulting in 19 KYA and 31 WIA. That report reached 10th Army headquarters by noon. By evening, it was on the desk of Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., commanding general of all ground forces on Okinawa. Buckner read it twice, then picked up a secure telephone and called Pearl Harbor. The call did not go to Admiral Whitfield. It went directly to Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. No transcript exists, but the result was immediate and unambiguous. On April 24th, 2 days after the Kakuzu assault, Whitfield's Joint Ordnance Review Board received new orders. The M10 production expansion request, submitted by Major Caldwell 3 weeks earlier, was approved without modification. Pine Bluff Arsenal was authorized to begin scaling production to 75,000 rounds per month. All existing M10 stocks in theater were immediately reclassified as priority anti-fortification ammunition. Marine and Army units on Okinawa received authorization to requisition white phosphorus bazooka rounds through standard ordnance channels effective immediately. Whitfield signed the approval documents personally. His objections were not recorded in the official minutes. Within a week, Chemical Warfare Service logistics teams were distributing M10 rounds across Okinawa. Caldwell, whose travel authorization had been blocked for 10 days, arrived on the island on April 29th to personally supervise training programs for bazooka operators unfamiliar with the white phosphorus ammunition. The training was rushed out of necessity. 3 hours of classroom instruction covering storage protocols, waterproof seal inspection, firing angle optimization for cave versus concrete targets, and one emphatic warning repeated until every operator could recite it from memory. Do not attempt to recover unexploded rounds. Do not handle ammunition with damaged seals. Do not fire within 30 yards of friendly positions due to particle scatter radius. Some units resisted the new ammunition. Veteran bazooka operators who had spent months perfecting shaped charge techniques viewed the M10 with suspicion. The yellow and white chemical warfare markings made men uncomfortable. Rumors circulated that the Geneva Convention prohibited white phosphorus use and that operators could face war crimes prosecution. Caldwell addressed these concerns directly, visiting frontline units to demonstrate the M10's capabilities and explain its legal classification as incendiary rather than chemical ammunition. The resistance faded quickly once operators saw combat results. On May 14th, Company K of the 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines engaged a cave complex near Shuri Castle that had resisted every conventional weapon for 6 days. 3 M10 rounds cleared the position in 8 minutes. 9 Marines who would have been casualties in a conventional assault walked away unharmed. Word spread through the ranks faster than any training program could. By the end of May, 10 rounds were the most requested specialty ammunition on Okinawa. Bazooka teams that had received 2 white phosphorus rounds per operator were requesting 6. Supply could not keep pace with demand, and on the other side of the line, something was changing. Japanese defenders who had held positions through week-long bombardments were abandoning fortifications after single M10 strikes. Interrogation of prisoners captured in late May revealed a growing terror. The white flame weapon dominated conversations among defenders. Men who had accepted death as inevitable discovered that there were forms of dying they could not accept. The phosphorus broke something deeper than morale. It broke the willingness to stay underground and wait for the end. But the Japanese military was not built on surrender. It was built on adaptation. And by June 1945, intelligence reports began filtering back to American lines that carried a new and troubling pattern. Captured documents showed Japanese engineers had obtained fragments of unexploded M10 rounds. They were analyzing the weapon. They were studying the phosphorus dispersion mechanism. They were developing countermeasures, and they were sharing their findings with every garrison preparing to defend the home islands against the American invasion that everyone knew was coming. The M10 had changed the war on Okinawa. But the Japanese were learning. They were adapting. They were preparing for Operation Downfall with specific plans to counter the weapon that had broken their island defenses. 500,000 M10 rounds were being manufactured for the invasion of Kyushu. The Chemical Warfare Service believed that number would be enough. In Part 3, we will discover why they were wrong. A grocery clerk from Illinois fired a rocket into a bunker on Iwo Jima and changed the mathematics of Pacific warfare. A chemist from Michigan fought a rear admiral in Pearl Harbor and won. An infantry colonel on Okinawa used 37 unauthorized rounds to clear a cave complex that had resisted 6 days of conventional assault with 0 friendly casualties. The M10 white phosphorus bazooka round had proven itself on 2 islands, survived bureaucratic assassination, and earned mass production authorization at 75,000 rounds per month. But as June 1945 began, intelligence officers on Okinawa started reading captured Japanese documents that carried a warning nobody wanted to hear. The enemy knew about the white flame. They were studying it. They were building countermeasures. And they were preparing to fight the weapon that had broken their island defenses on the beaches of Japan itself, where 500,000 M10 rounds and 14 million American soldiers were being assembled for the largest amphibious invasion in human history. This was no longer an experiment. This was an arms race against an enemy that learned from its dead. The first indication that Japanese military intelligence had prioritized the M10 threat came from a captured operations order recovered on May 28, 1945, during the assault on Shuri Castle. The document, translated by ICPOA analysts within 48 hours, was addressed to all garrison commanders in the Japanese Home Islands Defense Network. It bore the personal seal of General Korechika Anami, Minister of War, and it described the American white flame weapon in technical detail that stunned Allied intelligence officers. The Japanese knew the M10's weight. They knew its phosphorus payload was 1.3 pounds. They knew the particle dispersion radius was approximately 40 feet. They knew the warhead used a base detonating fuse rather than impact detonation. This level of technical specificity meant one thing. Somewhere on Iwo Jima or Okinawa, Japanese engineers had recovered intact or near intact M10 rounds from the battlefield, likely from the 8% of ammunition that arrived on Okinawa with damaged seals and was supposed to have been destroyed by EOD teams. but in the chaos of combat had been abandoned in forward positions. Anami's order directed 3 specific countermeasures. First, all fortified positions in the Kyushu defense zone were to install double-sealed blast doors at tunnel junctions to prevent phosphorus smoke from spreading through interconnected chambers. Second, garrison troops were to stockpile wet sand rather than water for fire suppression, based on the correct assessment that sand could smother phosphorus more effectively than water, which merely paused the burning reaction. Third, and most troubling, Japanese engineers were directed to widen ventilation shafts in underground positions to increase airflow, theoretically dispersing phosphorus smoke before it reached lethal concentrations. Allied intelligence estimated that implementing these modifications across the 17,000 fortified positions on Kyushu alone would require 3 to 4 months of construction. The invasion was scheduled for November 1, 1945. The Japanese had exactly enough time. Colonel Davis, now serving as a tactical advisor to the 10th Army's Chemical Warfare Planning Staff, read the translated document and immediately grasped its implications. The M10 had succeeded on Iwo Jima and Okinawa because Japanese defenders had no preparation against it. Surprise was half the weapon's effectiveness. On Kyushu, that surprise would be gone. Defenders would be trained, positions would be modified, and the psychological shock that had driven men from fortifications they had sworn to defend to the death would be diminished by familiarity and preparation. Davis sent his assessment to Caldwell at Pine Bluff on June 4th. The message was blunt. Current M10 design may be insufficient against prepared countermeasures. Recommend immediate development of enhanced dispersion warhead with increased phosphorus payload and extended burn duration. Timeline critical, 6 months maximum. But Caldwell was already fighting a different war. The production expansion that Nimitz had authorized in late April was running into problems that no admiral's signature could solve. Pine Bluff Arsenal's manufacturing capacity was designed for 15,000 rounds per month. Scaling to 75,000 required new production lines. Additional workers expanded raw material supply chains and modifications to quality control procedures that had been calibrated for small batch production. By mid-May, the defect rate on M10 rounds had climbed from 2% to 11%. The waterproof seals that protected the phosphorus charge from humidity were failing at alarming rates because the new production lines used a slightly different adhesive compound that had not been tested under Pacific theater conditions. On May 19th, a quality control failure at Pine Bluff produced a batch of 400 rounds with inadequately sealed warheads. 312 of those rounds were shipped to Okinawa before the defect was discovered. On June 2nd, a Marine ammunition handler on Okinawa named Corporal William Prescott was transferring M10 rounds from a beach supply dump to a forward ammunition point when a corroded seal on one of the defective rounds failed. The phosphorus ignited inside the canister. Prescott suffered third-degree burns across 40% of his body. 2 Marines working beside him received burns to their hands and arms. The ammunition dump containing 1,800 rounds of mixed ordnance, including 200 M10 rockets, had to be evacuated, and the phosphorus fire burned for 47 minutes before consuming itself. Prescott survived, but lost the use of his right hand permanently. The incident report reached Washington within 72 hours. Congressional staffers monitoring military procurement flagged the accident. Questions were raised about chemical weapons safety protocols. Admiral Whitfield, who had opposed the M10 program from the beginning, circulated a memorandum noting that he had warned of exactly this type of incident during the April Review Board. Caldwell faced the real possibility that the production expansion would be suspended pending a safety investigation that could take months. Months that Marines preparing for Operation Downfall did not have. For the first time since the program began, Caldwell questioned whether the M10's benefits justified its risks. The weapon saved lives in combat, but was killing and maiming the men who handled it in rear areas. The production defect rate was climbing. The Japanese were developing countermeasures. The political environment in Washington was turning hostile. Was the white flame weapon becoming more dangerous to its own side than to the enemy? But on June 11, 1945, 9 days after Prescott's accident, a battle on Okinawa answered that question with a clarity that silenced every critic. June 11, 1945, 05:15 hours. The Oroku Peninsula. The 6th Marine Division had been grinding into the Japanese naval base garrison on Oroku for 5 days. Rear Admiral Minoru Ota commanded approximately 4,000 naval troops, dug into a defensive network of caves, tunnels, and reinforced concrete positions that honeycombed the limestone ridges overlooking Naha Harbor. Ota's garrison was the last major organized Japanese force on southern Okinawa. His positions controlled the harbor approaches. His elimination was essential before the island could serve as a staging base for Operation Downfall. 5 days of conventional assault had produced 800 American casualties and advanced the line exactly 600 yards. Ota's defenses were the most sophisticated the Marines had encountered outside of Shuri. Triple-layered cave systems with blast doors between chambers. Interlocking machine gun positions with pre-registered fields of fire covering every approach. Mortar pits connected to observation posts by telephone wire, allowing precision indirect fire that made open ground movement suicidal. The 6th Marine Division's commanding general, Major General Lemuel Shepard, had requested maximum M10 allocation for Oroku. He received 1,200 rounds, the largest single distribution of white phosphorus ammunition in the Pacific War to date. Shepard's plan was unprecedented. Instead of using M10 rounds as individual bunker-busting weapons the way they had been employed since Iwo Jima, he ordered a coordinated white phosphorus barrage. 40 bazooka teams would fire simultaneously into the cave complex's identified entrances, ventilation points, and suspected tunnel junctions. The goal was not to clear individual positions, but to saturate the entire defensive network with phosphorus particles and smoke, making the entire cave system uninhabitable at once. 0517 hours. Shepard gives the order. 40 bazooka operators rise from cover across a half-mile front. 40 M10 rounds launch simultaneously. The rockets cross open ground in less than 2 seconds. 40 white explosions bloom across the limestone ridge like flowers made of fire. The effect is immediate. White smoke erupts from cave entrances across the entire front. Not just the 40 targeted openings, but from cracks, fissures, and ventilation points that Marines had never identified. The limestone acts as a delivery system, pulling burning particles and toxic smoke through natural channels into chambers hundreds of yards from the impact points. The smoke is so thick it rises in columns visible from ships offshore. 30 seconds after impact. The first defenders emerge, not in ones and twos, but in groups. 5 men from one cave mouth, 8 from another. A dozen stumbling from a tunnel exit on the ridge's reverse slope. They are choking. Some are burning. All are disoriented. Marine rifle teams open fire. 60 seconds. The trickle becomes a flood. Defenders are pouring from exits across the entire ridgeline. Some have dropped their weapons. Some are dragging wounded comrades. 2 officers emerge with swords still strapped to their waists, coughing so violently they cannot stand upright. Shepard watches from his command post 600 yards behind the line. He has never seen anything like this. In 30 years of Marine Corps service, he has never watched an entire defensive network collapse simultaneously. 90 seconds. The ridge is chaos. White smoke obscures half the positions. Defenders are running in every direction. Marine machine gun teams are engaging targets faster than they can shift fire. BAR teams are burning through ammunition magazines at rates that will require emergency resupply. 2 minutes after impact. Shepard orders the assault. 3 battalions advance into positions that 5 days of conventional combat could not breach. They meet almost no resistance. The caves are filled with white smoke so dense that Marines entering with gas masks cannot see their hands in front of their faces. Phosphorus particles still burn on walls, floors, and ceilings, producing an eerie white glow in the darkness. Equipment is abandoned everywhere. Weapons, ammunition, maps, communication gear, food supplies, Medical equipment. The defenders left everything. 3 hours. By 0830, the 6th Marine Division has advanced 2,000 yards, more than triple the distance gained in the previous 5 days. 167 fortified positions are neutralized. Over 300 Japanese defenders are killed, and 47 captured, the largest single capture of Japanese naval troops in the Pacific War. Marine casualties for the entire operation are 23 wounded and 4 killed. 4 dead against a position that had been producing 160 American casualties per day. When the after-action report reaches 10th Army headquarters, the mathematics are stark. 5 days of conventional assault produced 800 casualties and 600 yards of advance. 3 hours of M10 coordinated employment produced 27 casualties and 2,000 yards of advance. The ratio is not an improvement. It is a transformation. Admiral Ota and the remnants of his garrison retreated into the deepest chambers of his command bunker. On June 13th, 2 days after the White Phosphorus assault, Ota sent his final message to Imperial headquarters in Tokyo. The transmission described the American White Flame attack in detail, noting that the coordinated phosphorus barrage had accomplished in minutes what conventional bombardment had failed to achieve in days. Ota's message ended with a request that the defense of the home islands take the White Flame weapon into account during fortification planning. That night, Ota and his remaining staff committed suicide. The weapon had done more than clear a position. It had broken the last organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa. News of the Oroku assault spread through the Pacific Theater within days. The tactical concept of coordinated white phosphorus employment, using massed M10 fire to saturate entire defensive networks rather than targeting individual bunkers, was immediately adopted as standard doctrine. General Buckner, commanding all ground forces on Okinawa, issued a directive on June 15th establishing white phosphorus saturation as the preferred method for cave complex reduction across all Army and Marine units. Production priority for the M10 was elevated to the same level as artillery ammunition and small arms. Pine Bluff Arsenal received emergency authorization to hire an additional 800 workers and activate a secondary production facility at Huntsville Arsenal in Alabama. The defect rate problem that had caused Corporal Prescott's injuries was traced to the replacement adhesive compound and corrected by June 20th. New quality control procedures reduced the seal failure rate to less than 1%. Japanese prisoner interrogations, conducted throughout June and July, painted a picture of an army approaching psychological collapse on the fortification defense question. A lieutenant captured near Kunishi Ridge told interrogators that his company had received orders to hold their cave position to the last man. When the white smoke started pouring through the tunnels, 14 of his 32 men abandoned the position within 60 seconds. The remaining 18, including the lieutenant, followed within 2 minutes. "We trained to die," the lieutenant said through an interpreter. "We did not train to burn from the inside while choking on smoke we could not escape. The white flame took away our ability to choose how we died. It left us only the choice to run." By July 1945, the strategic calculus for Operation Downfall had shifted. Planners who had projected 500,000 American casualties for the invasion of Japan revised their estimates downward based on the M10's demonstrated capability against fortified positions. The revised projections, still classified, estimated that coordinated white phosphorus employment could reduce fortification assault casualties by 40 to 50% compared to conventional methods. The M10 had evolved from an experimental weapon fired by a trembling teenager on Iwo Jima into a strategic asset that shaped invasion planning at the highest levels. Major Arthur Caldwell received the Legion of Merit on July 4, 1945, for his contribution to weapons development and his persistence in overcoming institutional resistance to the M10 program. Colonel Raymond Davis received his second Silver Star for the Kakuzu assault. Staff Sergeant Robert Henderson, who had fired the first M10 rounds in combat on March 17th, was promoted to Technical Sergeant and assigned to train bazooka teams in the Philippines for Operation Downfall. PFC James Morrison, The grocery clerk who started it all spent the summer of 1945 firing M10 rounds at mock Japanese fortifications on Luzon, preparing for an invasion of Kyushu that would require every white phosphorus rocket Pine Bluff could manufacture. The M10 had changed the Pacific War. It had saved thousands of lives. It had broken the Japanese fortification defense doctrine that had turned every island into a slaughterhouse. But there is one chapter of this story that history almost forgot. What happened to the men who created the white flame, the men who fired it, and the men who survived it when the war ended, and the world decided it did not want to remember how victory was actually won? What happened when the government classified every document, sealed every record, and told the Marines who had carried white death in their ammunition bags to never speak of it again? That story, the final chapter, is one that almost no one knows. And it changes everything you think you understand about how wars end and what they cost the men who win them. A grocery clerk fired a rocket he had never seen before into a Japanese bunker on Iwo Jima. A chemist fought an admiral and won. An infantry colonel used 37 unauthorized rounds to prove that white phosphorus could crack open caves that nothing else could touch. A Marine general on Okinawa launched 40 rockets simultaneously and watched an entire defensive network collapse in 90 seconds. The M10 white phosphorus bazooka round traveled from a teenager's trembling hands to the strategic planning tables of Operation Downfall in 4 months. It reduced fortification assault casualties by 40 to 50%. It broke the will of defenders who had sworn to die in place. It changed the mathematics of the Pacific War. But there is a twist to this story that no after-action report recorded, no medal citation mentioned, and no history book preserved. Because on August 15, 1945, the day Japan surrendered the M10 program, did not receive a victory celebration. It received a classification stamp, a disposal order, and 50 years of enforced silence. The men who created White Flame, the men who fired it, and the men who survived it were about to discover that winning a war and being remembered for it are two very different things. August 17, 1945. 2 days after Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast. Pine Bluff Arsenal, Arkansas. Major Arthur Caldwell was standing on the production floor watching M10 rounds roll off the assembly line at a rate of 2,500 per day when the telegram arrived. Cease all white phosphorus munitions production effective immediately. Transition production lines to conventional ordnance by September 15th. Caldwell read it twice. He folded the telegram, placed it in his breast pocket, and walked back to his office without saying a word to anyone on the floor. The machines kept running for another 6 hours before the shutdown order filtered through official channels. In that time, Pine Bluff produced approximately 600 more M10 rounds that would never be fired in combat. Total wartime production stood at approximately 180,000 rounds. Roughly 35,000 had been expended in combat on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. 145,000 sat in depots across the Pacific and the continental United States, waiting for an invasion that would never come. Caldwell spent the next 18 months supervising the destruction of those rounds. White phosphorus ammunition cannot be simply burned or detonated. The particles scatter across wide areas, contaminating soil and water sources, creating hazard zones that persist for weeks. Each batch required controlled incineration in specially designed furnaces at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, with filtration systems to capture phosphorus pentoxide from the exhaust. It was tedious, dangerous, unglamorous work. The kind of work that earns no medals and generates no headlines. Caldwell completed the disposal program in March 1947 and returned to civilian life. He rejoined DuPont as a senior chemical engineer, worked on industrial phosphorus applications for 2 decades, and retired to a quiet house in Wilmington, Delaware in 1968. He never published a paper about the M10. He never gave an interview about his wartime service. The Legion of Merit he received in July 1945 sat in a desk drawer that his children discovered after his death in 1983. His obituary in the Wilmington News Journal mentioned his DuPont career, his church membership, and his service in World War II. It did not mention white phosphorus, the M10, or the weapon that had changed the Pacific War. Colonel Raymond Davis took a different path. He stayed in the Marine Corps and built a distinguished career that eventually earned him the Medal of Honor for actions at the Chosin Reservoir in Korea in 1950, where he led his battalion through 7 miles of enemy territory in sub-zero temperatures to relieve a surrounded unit. Davis rose to the rank of Major General before retiring in 1972. In every biography, every profile, every medal citation that followed him through 3 decades of service, the Kakuzu assault was mentioned only as a footnote. The words white phosphorus appeared nowhere in his official record. Staff Sergeant Robert Henderson went home to Oregon in late 1945. He took a job at a machine shop in Portland, married a woman named Eleanor, who he had been writing to since boot camp, and raised 3 children in a house 12 miles from where he grew up. Henderson attended Marine Corps reunions every year for 4 decades. He spoke freely about the men he served with, the friends he lost, the islands he fought across. He did not speak about the M10. When researchers from the Naval Historical Center found him in 1987 for an oral history interview, Henderson was 65 years old. He described the white phosphorus rockets as effective and necessary. Then he changed the subject to the 4 Marines whose bodies had lain uncollected in front of that bunker on March 17, 1945, the bodies that the M10 assault finally allowed his unit to recover. He remembered their names. He did not remember how many bunkers he had destroyed with white phosphorus. He remembered that Morrison's hands were shaking when he loaded that first round. He did not remember the technical designation of the ammunition. The things that mattered to Henderson were not the things that mattered to historians. And PFC James Morrison, the 19-year-old grocery clerk, whose trembling trigger pull started the M10's combat history, went home to Illinois in December 1945. He enrolled at the University of Illinois on the GI Bill, earned a degree in chemistry, and spent 34 years teaching high school science in a suburb of Chicago. His students knew he was a veteran. They did not know what he had done. Morrison told his wife about the white flame once early in their marriage, then never mentioned it again. When his son asked about the war in 1971, Morrison said he had been a rifleman in the Pacific. He did not mention Bazooka's Phosphorus or the weapon that had earned him a transfer to the invasion training force. Morrison retired from teaching in 1983 and died in 1997. His obituary mentioned his Purple Heart, earned from a mortar fragment on Iwo Jima, that the script of this story has not discussed because Morrison himself considered it unimportant. The obituary did not mention the M10. But the legacy of what these men built did not die with them. It evolved. The M10 disappeared from American arsenals after 1945, but the principle it established that psychological incapacitation could be more effective than physical destruction against fortified positions became a foundational concept in modern military doctrine. The Korean War produced the M30 white phosphorus round for the 3.5-inch Super Bazooka, a larger and more powerful descendant of the M10 that saw limited use against Chinese bunker complexes along the 38th parallel. Vietnam brought a new generation of white phosphorus weapons. The M34 white phosphorus grenade became standard issue for infantry squads. Artillery units fired thousands of M825 white phosphorus shells for smoke screening and marking, though their anti-personnel effects were well understood by every forward observer who called them in. The M10's basic concept incendiary material, delivered by rocket into enclosed defensive positions, evolved into thermobaric weapons that dominate modern anti-fortification warfare. The Russian RPOA Shmel, the American SMAWNE, and the shoulder-launched multi-purpose assault weapon all trace their tactical lineage to the same problem the M10 was designed to solve. How do you kill defenders inside positions that conventional explosives cannot collapse? The answer in 1945 was white phosphorus. The answer today is fuel-air explosive that creates overpressure waves lethal to anyone inside enclosed spaces. The chemistry changed. The principle did not. Across 70 years of conflict from the caves of Iwo Jima to the tunnels of Tora Bora to the urban basements of Fallujah and Mosul military forces, have consistently discovered that making a position uninhabitable is more effective than trying to destroy it. The M10 was the first weapon specifically designed around this concept, and its combat record on 2 Pacific islands provided the data that proved the theory. Total documented M10 combat employment across Iwo Jima and Okinawa accounted for the neutralization of over 400 fortified positions, the capture or elimination of approximately 2,000 Japanese defenders, and a casualty reduction rate that Marine Corps analysts estimated saved between 800 and 1,200 American lives in 4 months of combat. Those numbers are conservative. They do not account for the positions abandoned without contact because defenders heard what was coming and chose to retreat before the white flame arrived. They do not account for the operational time saved by reducing average bunker engagement from 45 minutes to 8 minutes time that allowed Marine units to advance faster and present smaller targets to Japanese artillery observers. They do not account for the flamethrower operators who lived because the M10 did their job from 300 yards instead of 30. But the most important legacy of the M10 was not technical, it was human. Every major military innovation in history shares the same story. Someone sees a problem that everyone else has accepted as unsolvable. Someone proposes a solution that everyone else considers impossible or insane. Someone fights the institution that would rather lose with familiar weapons than win with unfamiliar ones. And someone pays the price for being right too early. The M10 story follows this pattern with uncomfortable precision. The Chemical Warfare Service identified the fortification problem in 1943, 2 years before the weapon reached combat. 2 years during which Marines assaulted Japanese bunkers with weapons everyone knew were inadequate, absorbing casualties that a $3 rocket could have prevented. Admiral Whitfield's opposition in April 1945 was not unique. It was institutional antibody response, the immune system of a military bureaucracy attacking an idea that threatened established doctrine. Whitfield was not evil. He was not incompetent. He was a career officer protecting a bombardment doctrine that had defined naval warfare planning for a generation. The M10's success meant his doctrine had failed, and accepting that failure meant accepting responsibility for the Marines who had died on beaches his guns were supposed to have cleared. The same pattern repeats across military history. Billy Mitchell was court-martialed in 1925 for insisting that aircraft could sink battleships. He was right. Hugh Dowding was forced into retirement after winning the Battle of Britain because his defensive fighter strategy offended officers who believed in bomber offensive doctrine. He was right. Percy Hobart was dismissed from the British Army in 1940 for proposing specialized armored vehicles that his superiors considered ridiculous. His Hobart's funnies saved thousands of lives on D-Day. The institution resists. The innovator persists. The soldiers pay the price for the delay. This dynamic has not changed in 80 years. Modern military procurement still favors established programs over revolutionary alternatives. Billion-dollar weapon systems survive congressional review, while innovative solutions from junior officers and civilian engineers die in committee. The distance between a good idea and a deployed weapon remains measured not in months of engineering, but in years of institutional resistance. The M10 story is a reminder that the most dangerous enemy is sometimes not the one shooting at you, but the one sitting behind a desk telling you that the weapon that could save your life does not fit the existing doctrine. And there is one final detail that almost no one knows. In 1991, when the Cold War ended and the Department of Defense conducted a sweeping declassification review of World War II-era documents, a researcher at the National Archives named Patricia Hernandez was cataloging Chemical Warfare Service records from Pine Bluff Arsenal. Among thousands of production reports, safety logs, and disposal records, she found a small envelope tucked inside a folder labeled M10WP, Personnel Correspondence. Inside the envelope was a letter dated March 28, 1945, written on Marine Corps stationery. The letter was from Staff Sergeant Robert Henderson to Major Arthur Caldwell. Henderson had obtained Caldwell's name from the typewritten instruction sheet that accompanied the M10 rounds. The letter was 11 sentences long. Henderson described the March 17th assault in spare, precise language. He listed the bunkers destroyed. He named the Marines who had died trying to take those positions with conventional weapons in the days before the M10 arrived. Then he wrote one sentence that Caldwell kept for the rest of his life that was found in his personal effects after his death in 1983, copied onto a small card that he carried in his wallet for 38 years. The men who did not come home from this island would want you to know that what you built works, and the men who are going home because of it will never be able to tell you what that means, but I am telling you now. Henderson never knew that Caldwell carried those words. Caldwell never told Henderson that the letter arrived on the same day Admiral Whitfield denied the production expansion request. He never told anyone that reading a staff sergeant's 11-sentence letter in an office in Washington was the reason he refused to let the program die. Two men who never met, one a machinist's son from Oregon and the other a chemical engineer from Michigan, connected by a $3 rocket, and a war that demanded solutions faster than institutions could approve them. The letter was declassified in 1991. Henderson had died in 1989. Caldwell had died in 1983. Neither man ever knew the other's full story. From a trembling teenager on a volcanic island to a weapon that reshaped Pacific War doctrine in 4 months. From a chemistry experiment rejected by admirals to a strategic asset requested by generals. From 35,000 rockets fired in combat to 800 American lives saved on 2 islands. The M10 white phosphorus bazooka round was created by men who understood molecules, fired by men who understood survival, and buried by men who understood that some victories are easier to classify than to celebrate. 180,000 rounds manufactured, 35,000 expended, 400 fortified positions neutralized, approximately 1,200 American lives saved. 50 years of silence. One 11-sentence letter carried in a dead man's wallet. These are the numbers that define the white flame. They called it White Death. The Marines called it survival. And for 50 years nobody called it anything at all because the men who knew the truth had signed papers promising to forget. But paper burns. And some stories like white phosphorus cannot be extinguished no matter how hard you try to bury them. They keep burning until someone finally lets them breathe. If this story moved you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We have more classified weapons, forgotten innovations, and untold stories from the wars that shaped the modern world. Drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from and whether anyone in your family served in the Pacific. These were not just weapons. They were the difference between letters home and folded flags. And the men who built them, fired them, and kept silent about them for half a century deserve to have their stories told. Share this video, because history that stays classified protects no one, and the truth like white phosphorus burns brightest when it finally reaches the air.